And he crushed the local armies in a matter of days and brought a whole different sense of what government can do, which is a different world. The Muslims of Egypt and elsewhere were in shock. And in response, one found two most important opposite directions. One was Westernization, and the other was Islamization. And these eroded the medieval synthesis. Westernization was the process undertaken by Muslims oppressed by Western achievements who sought to minimize the Sharia and replace it with Western ways. For example, they wanted to distinguish religion, they wanted to disestablish religion and give equality of rights to women and non-Muslims, despite these being completely at variance with the Sharia. Ataturk, now Ataturk of Turkey, symbolizes effort. His program in the 1920s and 30s to westernize Turkey, not just modernize it, but westernize it, replace the fez with a little beret, replace Arabic script with Latin script. These were the thrust of the time. And it looked at that time that that was the way of the future. And indeed, even until 1970 or so, it appeared to be the inevitable Muslim destiny. Muslims would modernize this way. Resistance to it seemed futile. But in fact, the resistance proved to be deep. Ataturk had few successors. Turkey today is reverting back to an Islam of the sort that he'd be horrified with. Westernization turned out to be something that attracted visible and vocal, powerful elites. But about 1930 or so, reluctant elements that wanted Islam, developed their own program, especially in countries like Algeria, Egypt, Iran, and India. And they argued not just for application of the Sharia, but full, total, severe application of the Sharia. They said, the reason why we're weak is because we're not applying the Sharia. Ataturk said, the reason why we're weak is because we're not Western. They said, no, we need to go back to our own traditions and retrieve our strengths from the centuries past. But they did so in a new way, because in 1930, when already had Lenin in the Soviet Union, Mussolini in Italy, and soon to come Hitler in Germany, totalitarianism, total ideology, whereby the state takes control. This was the spirit of that time, and the Islamists borrowed from these European ideas, the superiority of the state, the admissibility of brutal force, confrontation with Western civilization. Through hard work, the Islamist forces gained in strength, dedication, money, and they burst into power with the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 in Iran, a turning point. This achievement by the Islamists inspired Islamists globally. Islamism over the past 30-some years has become adaptable and has evolved. So, for example, Khomeini reached power through revolution, violence, brutality. But these days, the leading Islamist state is no longer Iran, it's Turkey. Turkish Islamist leaders got to power 3 times now through elections, valid, legitimate elections which they won. They are not only undermining Turkish secularism, the AKP Islamists, but they're also offering a new model of Islamism. It need not be as brutal as it was in Iran in the late 1970s. Terrorism is just an tactic. People tend to see terrorism as the mechanism of Islamism, but that's only because the Islamists lack planes, ships, and tanks. It's only because they lack weapons of mass destruction. It's only because some of them have decided that violence is the way. There are other ways of doing it. Indeed, we in the West not only see violence, but we also see the Islamists working through the system. They do so in Turkey, where they win elections. They do so here, where they work with the media, they work in the law courts, they work with the government, they work with the schools. It's not violent. And I would argue to you that that's actually more successful than violence, criminality, terrorism. So the Islamists are on the march today, yet their ascendance is recent and has no guarantees of longevity. Indeed, like other radical utopian ideologies, Islamism will likely lose its appeal and decline in power. Certainly developments in Iran, and especially in Egypt, of late point in this direction. But also note that Islamists tend to fall out among themselves. The Shiites fight the Sunnis. The more radical fight the less radical. So the Shiites are fighting the Sunnis in Syria. The more radical and less radical are becoming ever more displeased and hostile to each other in Egypt. As they get closer, as they surge in power, Islamists are divided among themselves. So what I think is necessary is that anti-Islamist Muslims, Muslims who do not seek this full application of Islamic law, or even Islamic law at all, must develop an alternative vision of Islam, a modern synthesis, if you will. Choose among Sharia precepts, accept some, reject others. Render Islam compatible with modern values, which I believe is possible. Not aspiring to apply the Sharia full, but to work open-mindedly with what is there. And let me note a comparison with Judaism and Christianity. 500 years ago, all three of these major monotheistic religions, in some fashion, endorsed servitude, slavery, and in some fashion condemned interest on money. Well, Judaism and Christianity evolved, and now I don't believe that any Christians or Jews would say, you know, on second thought, maybe slavery is a good idea. Really, it's in the Bible. Condone. We in the United States had a pretty big war over this subject. Few Americans in the South will say, you know, really, we should go back to the slave system. It's over. It's closed. Interest on money. It was very contentious back in the 15th, 16th centuries, especially in Italy. It's closed. I mean, yeah, 20% a week is not acceptable, but 3% a year, is anyone going to say 3% a year is not workable? Immoral? Is usury? No, no one says that. In Islam, these are still open questions. Not only are there slaves in many countries, such as Mauritania, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, but there are some Muslim leaders who go so far as to say that you're not a Muslim unless you accept slavery. Not only is slavery something we find in the West to keep a block on us, Saudi diplomats and whatnot, just 2 weeks ago, one was arrested for keeping a slave in some American city. It happens all the time. And slavery is part of the warp and warp of life. It's astonishing that they still have this practice and they export this practice. Not only is it that, but it's something just normal. Well, that is unacceptable. That is medieval. And that can change. And there have been efforts in this direction. They haven't finished. It's still there. But Islam can and needs to evolve in this way, also with interest. There's now estimated to be nearly $1 trillion in what's called Sharia-compliant finance. No interest finance. All these banks that have emerged, they're modern. They date back to the 1930s. This notion of Sharia banks is something started in India by a very important theoretician named Bandudi. New idea, bad idea. I mean, it's essentially playing with words because they charge a service charge. They make you pay a service charge rather than interest. It's fairly fraudulent, but it's important. And it's not honest, and it's not modern, and it's not open to the outside world. So whereas Jews and Christians have changed their minds on a whole host of issues and are still dealing with other ones, look at the Anglican Church and homosexuality, practically dividing the church in two. These issues of what to keep and what to leave behind are part of religious modernization. And while Jews and Christians have done this much more, they're still in the throes of making these decisions. Female rabbis, female bishops. This is an ongoing process, and Islam is subject to it too. It's just much further behind. Muslims are engaged in this, but are not as modern. Muslims must modernize with regard to slavery and interest, not to speak of jihad, which is Muslim violence on non-Muslims. On supremacism, the notion that Islam is superior to all other religions, the concealing of women behind hijabs and and niqabs and jilbabs and so forth. Polygyny, more than one wife per man. Female genital mutilation, honor killings. The right to leave Islam. Now this is, in most Muslim majority countries, a capital crime. You can be executed for either becoming an atheist or joining another religion. Legal proceedings. In the traditional Shari system, there are no lawyers combating each other in court. There's a judge who makes the decision by himself with the defendant. A modern form of Islam will no longer endorse unequal female rights, the inferior status of non-Muslims, jihad, suicide terrorism, nor will it require the death penalty for adultery, breaches of family honor, blasphemy, and apostasy. And there are some positive signs. There are some signs that things are changing. They're small, they're limited, but they're signs of hope. For example, the Turkish religious authorities a few years ago decided to permit women to pray next to men and to attend mosque services while menstruating. Not huge, but significant. The Iranian government adopted a law permitting women greater rights to sue for divorce, which is important because the classical Muslim legal system, essentially, women has no right to divorce. An Iranian court granted a murdered Christian equal recompense with that of a Muslim. Again, important. In Sharia, a non-Muslim life was worth less than a Muslim life. A conference of leading Muslim scholars declared that female circumcision is contrary to Islam and an attack on women, and appealed to all Muslims to stop practicing this habit. Well, it hasn't gotten very far. The practice continues, especially in northeastern Africa, but at least you have some authorities on record saying, no, it's not a good idea. So what can be done? The main burden is on Muslims. The anti-Islamist Muslims, the modern Muslims, the secular Muslims, the liberal Muslims, the Muslims of Tahrir Square, Muslims of the University of Western Ontario, have a burden to think through this. And I think there are two main roles. One is that of activism